I'm Chris White, President of VSM Solutions, the makers of pmBLOX. And I'd like to talk to you today about the management policies that are in pmBLOX because that's a differentiating function. No other tool has that, and it's very important in the real world, and we've incorporated it within pmBLOX. And so there needs to be some basic understanding in addition to the video tutorials that talk about the actual details of filling out the management policies and what the interface looks like. But I just want to give you an overview right now. So if we look at the dynamic progress method overview diagram, and we have a separate tutorial on this. You've probably seen the video, how is pmBLOX different. We've also got a website, dynamicprogressmethod.com, and some of this is covered on there. But in this diagram that you see right now, where there is the number 1, up at the top where there's earned value calculations, basically we're talking about cost and schedule pressure right there. So this is what you feel when you're on the project and the status information is telling you you're either behind schedule or over budget or something like that. So that top green arrow where the number 1 is where the status information is coming from, and that's where you start with cost and schedule pressure. And now what we're going to talk about are the numbers 2 and 3 on this diagram. So let me draw some things out for you. So we said that you experience cost pressure and schedule pressure. And these are measured with earned value. This is CPI and this is SPI if you know your earned value metrics. But from each of these, what we're saying in that overview diagram is that based on what you feel from each of these, what's your preference for reacting? And your choices with each of them are to adjust overtime hours and adjust the number of resources assigned. And you have these options with both of those. So you've got overtime hours and you've again got the number of resources that may change. And those are shown with the numbers 2 and 3 on that diagram. So there's really, within the management policies, when we set a management policy, we have 4 rules that you get to choose. One is, how are you going to adjust overtime based on cost pressure? How are you going to adjust the number of resources based on cost pressure? How are you going to adjust overtime based on schedule pressure? And how are you going to adjust the number of resources based on schedule pressure? So within the management policies area, you're going to see, for every management policy, you're going to see 4 rules that you get to choose. And we have by default a lot of policies already in there, and you can go sort of explore those. So now let me walk through what each of the rules do for you. So within the management policies, the first, if you click on the drop-down box, you'll see the 4 rules for a management policy. And the first one's going to be, what's the overtime policy based on SPI, the schedule pressure. And we basically have a chart that looks like this, and your SPI value is on the x-axis, and the number of overtime hours is on the y-axis. Now, with SPI and CPI, something to know about those, when they equal 1.0, exactly 1, that means you're on schedule, you're on cost, that's perfect. If that number is ever above 1, that's great, it means you're ahead of schedule or you're under budget. But if that number drops below 1, that's when you're behind schedule or over budget. So you need to know that about the CPI and SPI variables. Now, so there's our 1.0 value for SPI. We've got 0, and the chart goes up to 2. Now, the number of overtime hours, generally, you're going to set something that says, as long as I'm ahead of schedule or on schedule, I'm not going to add any overtime hours. Now, where it gets interesting and where you put your preference is what happens when you start to get behind schedule. So on the x-axis going this way, that represents further and further behind schedule or more and more schedule pressure. And a typical response, and you can draw this differently in the actual input, but it's something that's proportional, basically looks like that. It says, you know what, as I start to fall behind schedule, I'll start to add a little bit of overtime, and then I'll eventually add more when I get really, really far behind schedule. So that's a proportional policy. And I think we actually make it look like 1 hour goes up to 2 hours, goes up to 4 hours, or something like that. The other option is you may be aggressive, and as soon as you're behind schedule, you says, you know what, I'm going to work everybody 4 hours of overtime immediately to get back on schedule. So that's an aggressive view. And of course, you could have anything in between, and by default, the default policies are all zeros and say, you know, no matter what, you're not going to add any overtime hours. Now that was with the schedule pressure, SPI. When it comes to CPI, what we're actually doing is it's the number of overtime hours to remove. Okay? So even if you're ahead of schedule, you're never going to dip into regular hours, regular work hours. You're never going to tell anyone, hey, go take the half a day off, we're ahead of schedule. But it only deals with overtime hours. So if in the simulation, schedule pressure has caused overtime hours to be added, cost pressure, if you're ahead of, if you're under budget, it says, well, I want to actually remove some hours. So again, there's your 1.0 value. It says as long as I'm under budget, don't do anything with that. And now as I get over budget, I'm going to actually start trying to reduce my costs by removing people from overtime work to lower my cost. And so actually what's very interesting is cost pressure and schedule pressure fight against each other all the time. And it's hard to actually react to both of them. That's why we give you charts for the 4 different options, because the reactions are exactly opposite. When I am behind schedule, I want to add overtime. But when I am over budget, I want to take people off and save money. So those two fight against each other all the time. So that's what the overtime charts look like for schedule pressure or for SPI and CPI. Now let's talk about changing the number of resources. And what we call that is a unit multiplier. And there's our 1.0 value. So what that means is no matter how many resources you have assigned, we're going to take that as the base number. And we're going to create a multiplier on that base number. So if I have 4 people assigned to a task, when my multiplier is 1, it says use 4 people. If my multiplier went up to 2, it would say use 8 people. So it's multiplying that base number. If I started with just 1 person, that would turn into 2 people. So it's just a multiplier. And what we have here, again, with a CPI, and let's take our 1.0 value, it says, you know what? As long as I'm ahead of schedule, I'm not going to add anybody to the job. But, I'm sorry, this is actually right here. My multiplier is 1.0. As long as I'm ahead of schedule, my multiplier is 1.0. I take the requested number of people. That multiplier, kind of like adding overtime hours, may go up as we move, as the schedule pressure drops below 1 right here. We're going to see that multiplier go up to, say, 1.5 or even 2.0. It says, hey, I'm going to double my resources. Now the opposite is true for CPI, and this may actually, and it says start reducing the number of people that you have and bring it down to 0.5 or 0.25, which says, hey, I just want a fourth of the people. So remember, schedule pressure and cost pressure always work against each other. Now that overview, that now when you get into using the tools and you look at the video tutorials on the actual management policies and how to fill them out and how to click and drag and things like that, now it'll hopefully make some sense, give you some context as to how those are actually used and how they make pmBLOX a better tool for your complex projects. Thank you.